Tuesday's news.
Hello, welcome to Old News, the programme and podcast which looks at news stories of the day through the papers of yesterday. Now, I hope you're not eating your breakfast. You might well be, being the time of day it is. But we're thinking dog poo, dog fouling, dog mess, dog... Yes, you get the gist. Talks of having a warden have been in the news again recently. A warden, a dog poo warden in parts of the island. Nothing new, I don't think. And indeed, the issue of the remains of dogs' dinners has been in the news for quite some time, longer than you might think. I'll take you back to 1938. In the Times, Saturday, March the 12th, fouling of Douglas footpaths is the headline. New bylaw carried. At the meeting of the Douglas Town Council on Wednesday, a recommendation was submitted by the Health Committee dealing with the fouling of footways by dogs. The recommendation was carried, and if it obtains the approval of Tynwald, a person will be liable to a fine of 40 shillings, quite a lot in 1938, if, while being in charge of a dog in any street or public place, he allows the dog to foul the footway. He is not to be convicted if he satisfies the court that the fouling was not due to culpable neglect or default on his part. For the purposes of the bylaw, the owner of the dog will be deemed to be in charge of it unless the court is satisfied that at the time of the alleged offence, it was in charge of some other person. Councillor E.H. Farragher, chairman of the Health Committee, moved the recommendation and said such a bylaw was long overdue. It was in force in England, and quite recently a dog owner in Blackpool was fined. They hoped the bylaws would make dog owners realise they should do what they could to prevent the footpaths of the town getting into the filthy condition they sometimes were. Councillor Corkle seconded. In the Examiner, Friday, April the 8th, 1938, Corporations Fouling Bylaw. Dog helps it through. Well, this would, yes. Fouling of the footway by a dog at the entrance to the legislative buildings on Tuesday morning as members of Tynwald arrived prompted a speedy passage of the Douglas Corporation's petition for the approval of the new bylaw. Well, that's one way to help speed dog fouling laws through. Get your dog to poop on the steps going in towards Tynwald. The Isle of Man Times, Saturday, January the 16th, 1943, Dirty Douglas Dogs, reads the headline. I rather like that. The fouling of the pavements of Douglas streets by dogs was discussed at a meeting of the Town Council on Wednesday, when Councillor Tier said he thought the police should have a roundup and keep all the dogs they found until they were claimed and see if the licences for them had been paid. Alderman Skillicorn thought Douglas and Ramsey were both overrun by dogs and that they were the worst towns in this respect he had ever been in. It was disgusting the way they were allowed to foul the streets. They had a bylaw on the subject, but there was a flaw in it which should be righted as soon as possible. Councillor Cowan said that only dogs under the control of someone were affected by the bylaw, and it had been laid down that dogs must be on a lead. Councillor Farragher doubted whether the streets and parapets were cleaned and swept as often as they ought to be, and he thought if this were done, a lot of the trouble would disappear entirely. Alderman Crane also complained about the conduct of the dogs. Councillor W.D. Radcliffe, chairman of the Health Committee, said that the matter had been before them several times, but there was little hope of having the bylaw enforced unless the police could take action. The best solution would be to exterminate half the dogs. I can imagine that going down well. Councillor T. Cowell thought the footpaths in the business parts of the town were well swept. The minutes were adopted. Also, we read of no dogs on Douglas buses. The decision of the Tramways Committee not to allow dogs onto their buses in future was discussed at the meeting of the Douglas Town Council on Wednesday, when the committee's decision was upheld. Councillor Kane said the committee's decision seemed to have been received with mixed feelings. He could understand the decision in the case of big dogs, but not in the case of small dogs such as lap dogs. He asked if there had been any complaints and thought that the decision might have been left to the discretion of the conductors. Replying, the chairman, Councillor Cowan, said the matter had received very careful attention. At the present time, during busy periods, the buses were full to capacity and they had to carry a good many standing passengers. The committee felt that it was in the interests of the travelling public that dogs should be prohibited from travelling in buses, and numerous complaints had culminated in a child being bitten. The report was carried. The Examiner, Friday, January the 15th, 1943, we read of dirty dogs. Town council discuss their manners. Bylaw of little use, as we've just been hearing. Douglas Town Council spent a happy half hour on Wednesday discussing the fouling of public footways by dogs. Referring to a finance committee minute drawing the attention of the health department and the police to this trouble, Councillor A.J. Tier, MHK, said the matter had been before the council several times when the health committee were doing all they could. The main thoroughfares were swept every day and the side streets perhaps once or twice a week. People who did not control their dogs properly were doing a great disservice to the public and not playing the game. He thought there were far too many dogs prowling the streets and suggested the police should get hold of one or two and keep them until they were claimed, as we were hearing earlier on. Alderman Skillicorn said he thought Douglas and Ramsey were more overrun with dogs than in any other town he'd been in, and it was disgusting. He'd also seen dogs being led on a leash to evacuate their excreta on the steps at somebody's gate, and even on their doorsteps. Dogs should be trained to use the gutter, as they could be trained. Councillor T.C. Cowan said he thought the bylaw would have to be amended because he believed action could only be taken when the dog was on a lead. People could simply slip the lead and could not be touched under the bylaw. Dogs were allowed out by themselves for this express purpose. Councillor J.C. Farger said he doubted whether the streets and parapets were swept as often as they ought to be. If they were swept more often, a lot of this trouble would disappear. And here's an interesting thought from Alderman W.C. Crane, MHK, suggested that owing to less meat being available, this being 1943 of course, so the war was on, the dogs were being fed more on bread crusts and wheatmeal flour might be to blame. He'd never seen the footpaths of Douglas more fouled than at the present time, and it was high time some action was taken. Councillor W.D. Radcliffe said there was no cure until people educated their dogs to manners which they apparently did not follow themselves. So long as the police condoned it, he did not see there would be any improvement. The suggestion that people of the borough ought to do a little work in sweeping of their property, as they had to do in the event of snow, was made by Councillor T. Cowell. They would then appreciate better what the sweepers had to do. Replying as chairman of the Finance Committee, Councillor W.S. Shimon said the difficulty was that the bylaw was not strong enough. It had been before the Health Committee time after time and cost them a good deal of worry. They tried to get a conviction in one case, but found many difficulties. There had to be a witness unless a policeman took it up, and the dog had to be on a lead. It's a tricky problem, particularly when there's a dog to every 4 houses, as we read in the Times of Saturday, February the 19th, 1944. The council has been considering the nuisance caused by the fouling of footways by dogs. A bylaw on the subject passed some years ago, but the town clerk recently reported to the council's finance committee there was difficulty in proving offences, as we've been hearing, and stated he'd obtained copies of similar bylaws made in English towns. The Douglas bylaw is similar to those in operation in various places, including the holiday resorts of Morecambe, Heysham and Rhyl. Heysham was a holiday resort, my word, but varies from the bylaw in operation in Brighton, Blackpool, Bournemouth, Eastbourne, Llandudno and Southport, and the committee recommend that the latter bylaw should be adopted in Douglas. Under the present bylaw, a person in charge of a dog in a street is not to allow the dog to foul in the footway, but it is provided that he shall be liable to be convicted if he satisfies the court that the fouling was not due to culpable neglect or default on his part. It's proposed to replace all this by a simple statement that no person being in charge of a dog in the street and having the dog on a lead shall allow the dog to foul the footway. The penalty is a fine not exceeding 40 shillings. Sounds sensible enough, doesn't it? Dirty Dogs bylaw, corporation tries to make it stronger. Opposition at town council meeting, we read in the Times of April the 15th, 1944. Bearing in mind the previous one was, in February, so it's been going on for a couple of months. Recently, the Douglas Town Council reconsidered the bylaw with regard to dogs fouling the footway and amended it so they imagined in such a way as to make it more workable. The bylaw had to be brought before Tynwald for confirmation, and Tynwald referred it back with a view to its being made stronger. After consultation with their legal advisers, they are trying again, and a proposed new bylaw was submitted at the monthly meeting on Wednesday, when there was considerable opposition, and the rescinding of the proposal rejected by Tynwald was carried out by a bare majority of 11 to 10. The proposal, which Tynwald considered insufficient, placed the responsibility for the dog's offence on any person being in charge of the animal and having it on a lead. The penalty was a fine not exceeding 40 shillings. Now it is suggested that if a dog fouls the footway under any circumstances, the owner shall be liable to be proceeded against, but no proceedings are to be instituted until after the 31st of March 1945. The original bylaw, which presumably is still in force, provided that the person in charge of the dog must not allow the nuisance to be committed, but is not liable to be convicted if he satisfies the court the nuisance was not due to his culpable negligence or default. It was reported to the town council that the new bylaw, which they vainly submitted to Tynwald, was in operation in Brighton, Blackpool, Bournemouth, Eastbourne, Llandudno and Southport, as we heard. 1954, and yes, who was in the postbag? The editor's postbag, The Times, Saturday, June the 5th of that year, fouling of footpaths. To the editor, I read in Saturday's Weekly Times a notice by the Commissioners of Port St Mary that they presented to Tynwald a bylaw in relation to dogs fouling footways, etc. in their district. Now, I did not notice any appeal or bylaw asking by any Douglas Committee authorities for the prevention of the fouling of footways in lanes or streets in Douglas. The footpaths are very often a disgrace to the town. Dogs' filth can be seen everywhere and any time. I have never, nor anyone else, seen a seaside town so utterly scattered with this dirt. There should be a law passed at once to combat this evil. Who'd have thought they'd spent so many hours debating exactly this 10 years earlier? I've already overheard visitors this year commenting on the subject, which can also be seen by any official unless he is shutting his eyes, which would be rather dangerous if he's walking for all sorts of reasons. And this is signed Cleanliness. And we read of the editor's note: the Douglas Corporation took steps to combat this nuisance many years ago. They did indeed. A fine of 40 shillings can be imposed on the owner of a dog if the animal is found fouling the footpath, but proceedings are difficult to start since neither the dog nor the owner can be traced easily. The only alternative is to employ an army of road sweepers with instructions to give particular attention to pavements. Suffice to say, dog mess has been in the news for quite some time. And here we are in 2026 with the issue still seemingly not sorted, albeit it is somewhat better in that the vast majority of good dog owners, and it is the vast majority, do clean up after their dogs. And as always, it's the small minority who spoil it for the others. What do you do about it? Who knows? Suffice to say, it's old news. Until next time, just hope you're not having sausages for breakfast. Cheerio.
You're gonna be yesterday's news.